Recently on YouTube and Twitter, there's been a bit of a stir regarding the YouTube channel The Game Theorists, and more specifically the channel's founder, MatPat. MatPat has pretty much always been seen as the gaming nerd of YouTube. He's been on the platform for more than a decade at this point, and is one of the most successful YouTube channels on it. Although the channel was popular long before FNaF, when FNaF actually came onto the scene, game theory exploded in popularity. Both the series and the content creator soared to new heights, and well, mutual insanity. With MatPat's dissection of every game in the franchise, it started a sort of friendly rivalry between FNaF's creator Scott Cawthon and himself. Each game that MatPat took apart and put back together, Scott would challenge him further in the next entry, at the cost of everyone else trying to keep track of it. From a non-theorist standpoint, I can understand why the FNaF story is damn near inaccessible for outsiders, but still, I and many others really like trying to solve it. This results in several videos you've probably seen on your feed before if you regularly watch my content or other similar content. Timeline videos. Most of the time this amounts to theorists trying to dissect where each individual major event of the series takes place, and more importantly, when they take place. But here's the thing. I typically don't like timeline videos as a concept because they're very promising. After all, you're promising a simple to follow version of a complex story that doesn't reveal its own answers. For that reason, I think it's very difficult to make one that gets everything completely right. Hell, even I'm somewhat guilty of this. Both my videos covering Who is William Afton and Who is Michael Afton lay out a somewhat rough timeline of events, and looking back, I probably would have gone about those videos differently had I known I was essentially doing what I hated. That's why I actually really enjoyed the Oof Troops parody timeline series and undeniably canon FNaF timeline. Check it out, it's a great watch. But back to MatPat. MatPat has recently started revealing his FNaF timeline through several videos covering different and distinct eras of the story. One was the Foundations, what came before the first restaurant. The next is the Afton Era, which covers the majority of the games in the series, and the last is the Post-Purple Guy Era, which covers FNaF AR, Help Wanted, and Security Breach. But here's the thing, this video is not supposed to be me covering all those eras, but rather it's going to be about the most divisive moments in MatPat's FNaF timeline and why the timeline itself is so difficult to solve. So let's start with something I noticed right away, and harped onto my friends and my followers on Twitter. That being the very odd decision for MatPat to solve FNaF 4 twice. Now you may think I'm being absurd, but I promise you I'm not. Twice in this series does MatPat actually explain the gameplay of FNaF 4, and I don't think either time he got it right. The first is what he describes in the second video of the series. In this video, MatPat explains that the gameplay of FNaF 4 is being played from the perspective of Michael Afton, who's being tormented by the nightmare animatronics. The nightmare animatronics, as MatPat explains, are actually alternative versions of what we call the Twisted Ones. The Twisted Ones are animatronics that use illusion technology to make themselves look like terrifying monsters, when in reality they're blank and plain. Since the Twisted Ones don't exist in the game universe, MatPat believes the nightmare animatronics are their stand-ins. William Afton, the father of Michael, uses these animatronics to torment his son after the death of Michael's brother, the crying child, after Michael accidentally pranked him so hard he died. That's the first time MatPat explains it, and while I don't agree that the nightmares are stand-ins for the Twisted Ones, this theory is one a lot of the FNaF community kind of already believed. But then MatPat brought it up again. In the third video of the series, the most recent entry, MatPat explained that as an adult, Michael would have recurring nightmares involving the nightmare animatronics, and sometimes hear the reversed audio of the FNaF 1 phone call, since canonically, he would have heard that phone call. Twice, MatPat explained the events of FNaF 4, one being an actual nightmare, and one being reality. He's playing both sides of the coin, except in my opinion neither of these sides are the right one. As revealed in the FNaF Character Encyclopedia, a book MatPat read on one of his alternative channels, GT Live, it is not in fact Michael Afton having these nightmares, but instead the crying child, his brother. This makes sense given they happen during the week leading up to the crying child's birthday, during the minigames where we straight up play as CC. Although this means we need a new explanation as to how Michael knows what Nightmare Fredbear looks like, I think we need to accept that in no way is Michael connected to the gameplay of FNaF 4. In fact, in order to debunk the Twisted Ones theory a bit further, I want to ask, what happens when you lose in FNaF 4? Rather than the static following your jump scare like in most FNaF games, you instead get a blood splatter, meaning that the player has most likely been bitten and killed. Tell me then, does it make sense for William to let the nightmare animatronics kill Michael? Keep in mind that William actively wanted his daughter to avoid the animatronics. Would it make any more sense for William to actively attack his son with these nightmares? I don't think so. We don't really have any reason to think this. Hell, William never even shows outward aggression to Michael until he becomes Springtrap. And that actually leads me to my next point in breaking open MatPat's timeline, that being Springtrap. Or rather, when William should theoretically become Springtrap. Let me explain. As MatPat writes, Michael Afton first discovered the sister location bunker after his father had disappeared for a length of time. This would presumably be the time Afton is dead and becoming Springtrap. However, MatPat goes on to say that sister locations events are what inspire Michael to investigate each Freddy's location, becoming the night guard Fritz Smith in FNaF 2 and Mike Schmidt in FNaF 1, only to re-encounter his father years later in FNaF 3. The only problem is that this cannot be the order of events. Given that the layout of the building in the FNaF 3 minigames is the same as the building layout in the first FNaF game, we know this is where William died. But William could have only died after the events of FNaF 1 because he dismantled all of the animatronics from that location. So if William wasn't dead yet, then why did he go missing and inspire Michael to go into the sister location bunker? We can't make up for an unfounded disappearance like that. And here's the thing, up until this point I did have a nagging thought in the back of my head. Maybe William did die at this point in the timeline, and that inspires Mike to go on his FNaF adventures or whatever. But this can't happen either, because MatPat claims that Michael goes on to become Fritz Smith at the FNaF 2 location, meaning the FNaF 1 location isn't even around yet. There's clearly something up here, and I think another reason that when you make a timeline video, try to make it as not fanfiction-y as possible. It's at this point I want to stop picking apart MatPat's timeline and start explaining why the actual timeline is so damn hard to solve that it requires this much explanation. And in doing so, I will actually still be kinda critiquing how MatPat and a bunch of other theorists tackle their timeline making. There are three elements I think ultimately made the FNaF story incomprehensible. Those being the books, cheap disguises, and something called pulling a Jeremy. So let's tackle that first point head on. The books. Now, some FNaF fans, including MatPat, consider the books to be required reading in order to understand the FNaF franchise. After all, how can you possibly understand The Puppet is Possessed unless you learn about sea bonnies? On the other hand, many other theorists denounce them entirely. Wright had an entire series trying to solve the FNaF timeline without using the books. But the fact remains that no matter how much you may hate it, the books do help. They help connect the dots in ways the games simply can't. For example, Henry and William's relationship. Before the FNaF novel, Five Nights at Freddy's The Silver Eyes, we had never heard of Henry as a character. Henry in the novel is William's former business partner, who is repentant over his involvement in William's ability to commit his crimes. This ended up being Henry's characterization later on in the games, but unless you had read The Silver Eyes, you wouldn't know who Henry was, or why he hated Afton. That being said, Scott Cawthon, ever the brilliant writer, decided that when it came to his short story series, things would become a little messed up. Scott wrote in his books, alongside a slew of other writers, a number of short stories in a series called Fazbear Frights. However, he messed this up by stating that some of these stories would be canon to the games, and some would not. What does this mean? Good luck, because nobody can say for certain which ones are and aren't canon. As is most likely, any story directly connected to the Stitch Wraith storyline, which is the epilogue storyline littered throughout the series, is part of a separate continuity, especially given how none of it is ever actually referenced in the games that followed after. There is an exception to this. The plush trap chaser from the story Out of Stock did actually appear on the side of an arcade cabinet in Security Breach, adding on to the idea that these books are fictitious in universe. With that being said, where does that leave literally every other story in Fazbear Frights? Not all of them are going to end up being so interconnected to the Stitch Wraith storyline, and we know that some of them are game canon, so which ones? But what if I have it backwards? What if the Stitch Wraith storyline is canon to the games, and the rest aren't? That's even worse. Why is it worse? Well, how about it goes directly against what the games tell us? In the story, a child named Andrew is the child who was killed and stuffed inside the Golden Freddy suit, as his description in the epilogue matches the description of the body found inside the Fredbear suit in the story The New Kid. Andrew then attaches his spirit to Afton, just like Golden Freddy did in the games, although Andrew would later go on to possess Fetch and eventually be one of the two souls inside of the Stitch Wraith. However, this is not what happens in the games. In the game's timeline, Golden Freddy's name is not Andrew but actually Cassidy, and is most likely a girl. This is referenced in yet another book, the Security Logbook, as well as one of Scott Cawthon's scrapped screenplays for the FNaF movie. So without a doubt, the Stitch Wraith cannot be canon to the games. Right? Moving on. Cheap disguises. This is what I'm referring to as basically any time that a character pretends to be someone else. And oh my god. So obviously there's Michael Afton, making it exceptionally hard to track him down with his constant name changes. Oh, and also that period of time where he became a second purple guy. That's right, there's multiple purple guys now. Michael might be the worst offender in this regard, but he's far from the only one. Arguably, Gregory isn't a cheap disguise, with his outfit, including a band-aid on the knee, closely resembling official artwork of the crying child. And then honestly, jury's still out on this one, but I'll also consider Yellow Guy to be a cheap disguise, if he ends up being William Afton. This is only because William is always represented by the color purple. Yellow makes literally no sense other than to just confuse people. So, what is a cheap disguise? To me, a cheap disguise is any design decision or change that is only meant to mislead the viewer or player and doesn't contribute to the actual story. You could argue that Michael becoming purple is part of the story, but I still consider it a cheap disguise because Scott had to know that it would just cause chaos over a plot point that ended up not even being true. That being, fans thought Michael was actually the killer and that he was Springtrap. And the thing is, FNaF has plenty of good disguises as well. Lefty and Vanny come to mind specifically. These are two characters who are secretly another character in some sort of disguise, and this ends up adding to the plot of the game both times. William being yellow does not. Another cheap disguise in a different way comes to us in Sister Location and the Twisted Ones, where the Twisted Ones are drawn pretty much exactly like the Funtime animatronics. This is never elaborated on again, and only caused more confusion for people playing the games. Had these Twisted Ones looked closer to the FNaF 1 or 2 cast, I doubt anyone would bat an eye, but the fact that it was this specific group is definitely what caused so much debate. That's one hell of a cheap disguise to me. The ultimate effect of the cheap disguise in the FNaF timeline is it means we can never trust a character to be who they really are. We can't trust Burntrap to actually be a version of William Afton because of this trope, and we can't trust Glamrock Freddy to be Michael Afton either. And the last thing that ruined the FNaF timeline to me anyway is pulling a Jeremy. What does this mean? As far as I can tell, it was MatPat who coined this phrase, but I might be wrong about that. Anyway, Scott Cawthon has a habit of using the name Jeremy a lot in the FNaF series. The name of the FNaF 2 Night Guard is Jeremy Fitzgerald. One of the missing kids is named Jeremy. There's a Jeremy in Help Wanted who cut his own face off. Even in Fazbear Frights, there's a character named Jeremiah, but on his birthday cake, it instead says the name Jeremy. Despite this, there doesn't seem to be any connection between any of these characters. They're all different. Some of them don't even get themselves involved in the main story. This is what pulling a Jeremy means. When information is repeated deliberately, either as an ongoing joke or as a red herring. And although Jeremy itself is understood as nothing more than a series of ongoing callbacks, it's really thrown into question the legitimacy of actual recurring patterns that might reflect the story. For example, throughout several pink slips in the series, we see characters fired for tampering with the animatronics and odor. This is usually at the end of a custom night. But then Scott basically told us Michael was a rotting corpse. It became a question of, is this a joke, or did he actually get fired because he smells like death? The reason this is important to answer is because it would say whether or not Michael was the Night Guard of FNaF 2. This simple recurring joke was turned into a piece of volatile evidence. How about the Nightmare staff bots resembling Nightmarion, and also how Nightmarion plushes are hidden all throughout the Mega Pizzaplex in Security Breach? Is there actually a connection to the Nightmarion here, or is this simply another example of pulling a Jeremy? Now, I'll be blunt. I actually like the Jeremy joke for what it is, but its consequences far outweigh the comedy of that joke for me to think it's worth telling and repeating. Pulling a Jeremy is even common in the books. There are several characters who either share names with game characters or seem to parallel them in some way, including Michael. Michael is the name of Evan's brother from the story The Real Jake. I've covered that story before, but basically Michael in that story is just a side character with next to no relevance to the plot, and he shares a name with the main protagonist of the entire series. Great. Consider this Jeremy pulled. And there you have it. What I consider to be the main 3 reasons that the FNaF timeline is so irreparably damaged. Being real, unless Scott Cawthon or Steelwool actually puts out a statement telling us what is and is not true, then we can only expect the story to further deteriorate. That said, it continues to at the very least be entertaining to talk about. That's all out of me. I'm DMuted. Be sure to like and subscribe. It helps me out more than you think. It's free, and you can opt out whenever you like. Peace.
He won too! Bruh! Was that the bruh? 8 of 87?